was a living god.
That chair.
They together. Darkness.
Do you hear me?
The woman trapped here is no ordinary corpse. She is an ancient mummy who has somehow remained alive for over 5,000 years. Her skin is covered from head to toe in strange markings, symbols, and ancient writings, almost like her entire body has been turned into a forbidden spell. Thick metal chains are wrapped around her, locking her down so tightly that escape should be impossible. Even worse, needles are inserted into her wrists and neck, constantly pumping mercury into her body, every minute, every day, without stopping. This is not being done randomly. According to old legends, mercury can weaken dark and demonic power, and in her case, that power is terrifying. If this woman ever breaks free, she could summon violent sandstorms, spread destruction across entire cities, and bring devastation on such a massive scale that the world itself could be wiped out with nothing more than a movement of her hand. Her name is Princess Amenet. Centuries earlier, in the year 1127 AD, a Crusader knight was laid to rest in England, but he was not buried alone. Hidden inside his tomb was a mysterious red gemstone, an object that seemed far too important to be placed with an ordinary soldier. In the modern day, construction workers digging a new underground transport tunnel accidentally break into something much older than anyone expected. Beneath the city, they uncover a forgotten burial ground filled with the remains of Crusader knights. Some parts of the cemetery have even been swallowed by water over time. Experts begin to suspect that these knights were the same men who once marched into Egypt during the Crusades, only to return home carrying something far more dangerous than gold or weapons. They brought back a secret. Soon after the discovery, Dr. Henry Jekyll arrives at the site. He is a man completely consumed by the study of supernatural artifacts and ancient cursed objects. The moment he sees what has been uncovered, he takes charge of the excavation without hesitation. To him, this is not just an archaeological find. This is the missing piece he has spent years trying to locate. It is connected to the lost history of Princess Amenet. Thousands of years ago in ancient Egypt, Amenet was the daughter of a powerful pharaoh. She was beautiful, intelligent, feared, and ruthless. People saw her not just as royalty, but as someone destined for divine rule. At that time, she was her father's only child, which meant the throne was supposed to belong to her. She had been raised to believe that one day the entire kingdom would bow before her, worship her, and accept her as Egypt's future queen. But everything changed when the pharaoh unexpectedly had a son. With the birth of a male heir, Amenet's place in the royal line was instantly taken away. The future she had been promised disappeared in a single moment. To her, it was not just a political change, it felt like a betrayal from her own bloodline. Consumed by anger and humiliation, Amenet turned toward something far darker than revenge alone. She made a pact with Set, the god of death. In exchange for her soul, Set gave her terrifying supernatural strength and the power to destroy those who had taken everything from her. But the bargain came with one condition. Amenet had to help Set return to the world of the living by giving him the body of a mortal man. Blinded by rage, Amenet carried out her vengeance without hesitation. She killed her father, the pharaoh, and then turned on her younger brother as well, showing no mercy even to a child. But before she could complete the ritual that would bring Set into the mortal world, Egyptian priests stormed in and stopped her. They captured her before the ceremony could be finished. Her punishment was worse than death. Amenet was mummified alive. After sealing her in that cursed state, the priests knew Egypt itself was no longer safe as her prison, so they took her far away from her homeland and buried her in a remote place, making sure she would never be able to return and finish what she had started. In the present day, in Iraq, USS, Army Sergeant Nick Morton and his partner, Corporal Chris Vale, are secretly searching for the place where Amenet may have been buried. Their mission is not exactly official. Dr. 2F'er Henry has been paying them under the table to locate the tomb, which means they have to move carefully and make sure no one discovers what they are really doing. But when Nick and Chris reach the area, the situation is nothing like they expected. The location is crawling with heavily armed rebel fighters. Chris immediately realizes how dangerous things are becoming and starts thinking they should leave before the whole mission turns into a death trap. Nick, however, refuses to walk away. He convinces Chris to stay and finish what they came there to do. Within moments, everything goes wrong. The two soldiers are caught in a brutal firefight with the rebels. Bullets fly from every direction, and they quickly become pinned down with no clear escape. With the rebels closing in, Nick and Chris are forced to call for an airstrike. Fighter jets soon arrive overhead, and the entire area is rocked by massive explosions. The blasts scatter the enemy fighters, but the bombing also destroys part of the ground beneath them. As the dust settles, a huge section of the site collapses, revealing something hidden deep below the surface. Amenet's ancient tomb. Nick nearly falls into the giant crater created by the destruction, barely managing to avoid being swallowed by the broken ruins. What began as a secret black market treasure hunt has suddenly uncovered something far older and far more dangerous than either of them imagined. A few hours later, Colonel Greenway, Nick and Chris's commanding officer, arrives at the location. He is immediately suspicious. From what he can see, it looks like the two soldiers may have abused their military authority to search for ancient artifacts and sell them illegally for profit. Nick and Chris quickly try to defend themselves, claiming they were only in the area because they believed rebel forces were hiding hostages in a nearby village. But before their story can go any further, Army archaeologist Jenny Halsey arrives at the scene. The moment she sees Nick, she walks straight up to him and slaps him in front of everyone. Furious, Jenny reveals that just a few nights earlier, she had spent the night with Nick in Baghdad. Afterward, she claims he stole an important map from her, a map that led directly to this location. Nick immediately denies it, trying to act innocent, but Jenny clearly does not believe a word he says. Then Jenny notices the enormous opening in the ground. As she studies the structure below, confusion spreads across her face. The tomb has unmistakable Egyptian design and construction, yet they are standing in Persian territory. To Jenny, that makes no sense at all. An Egyptian tomb buried this far from Egypt is not just unusual, it is impossible. Jenny tells Greenway that her responsibility is to recover and protect any historically valuable objects they may find, especially artifacts that could be worth billions. Because of that, she insists on going down into the site herself to examine whatever is hidden below. Greenway eventually agrees, but he orders Nick and Chris to go with her. Before they leave, he gives them a clear warning. They have only 2 hours inside. After that, they are coming back up, no excuses. Soon, the three make their way down into the buried chamber. The deeper they go, the stranger the place becomes. When they reach the lower section of the tomb, Nick notices something dripping from the ceiling in thick, silvery drops. It is mercury, and there is a lot of it. Jenny explains that in ancient Egyptian tradition, mercury was believed to repel evil forces and weaken spirits connected to darkness. So whoever built this place may have designed it specifically to contain something dangerous. Following the stream of mercury, they move further into the underground structure until they enter another chamber. Jenny begins studying the walls, the symbols, and the layout, trying to understand what kind of burial site this really is. Meanwhile, Chris quietly wanders away and starts stealing gold ornaments from the skeletons scattered across the cave floor, stuffing whatever he can find into his own pockets. As Jenny continues looking around, she notices something unusual. Every statue in the chamber is positioned toward the massive pool of mercury in the center. That alone feels strange, but then she realizes something even more troubling. There are no ritual objects, no offerings, and none of the usual arrangements meant to help a dead person pass into the afterlife. That is when the truth hits her. This is not a tomb, it is a prison. Jenny explains that the chains running into the lake of mercury were never meant to lower someone into a burial place. They were made to hold something down. Whoever was placed here was not being honored after death. They were being trapped, sealed away, and prevented from ever getting out. Just then, Greenway contacts them over the radio and tells them to leave immediately. A large rebel force is moving toward their position, and they do not have much time before the area becomes a battlefield again. But Jenny refuses to walk away without knowing what is buried beneath the mercury. Chris argues with her, clearly wanting to get out before they are surrounded, but Jenny keeps pushing to continue the investigation. During their argument, Nick spots a strange pulley mechanism connected to the center of the chamber. It looks like it is supporting something heavy beneath the surface. Without thinking too much, Nick raises his weapon and shoots the mechanism. For a moment, everything goes silent. Then, slowly, something begins rising out of the mercury. An ancient sarcophagus emerges from the silver liquid, sealed tight and covered in markings from a forgotten age. At the same time, the entire cave seems to wake up. Spiders pour out from cracks in the walls and crawl across the floor in huge numbers. One of them bites Chris, and he immediately panics. Terrified, he starts firing his gun wildly in every direction, nearly hitting everyone around him. Nick rushes over and tries to calm him down, telling him the spiders are harmless and not poisonous, but Chris is already shaken badly. Then Nick turns his attention back to the sarcophagus. As he stares at it, reality suddenly slips away from him. He sees a vision of Aminette standing before him, speaking directly to him as if she has been waiting for this moment for thousands of years. She tells him that by freeing her from her prison, he has become the chosen one. A few seconds later, Jenny snaps Nick out of the trance. He is back in the chamber, but he looks deeply unsettled by what he just experienced. Jenny tells him they need to transport the sarcophagus so it can be examined properly. Still disturbed, Nick relays the message to Greenway, and Greenway quickly calls in a helicopter to lift the coffin out of the tomb. As the sarcophagus is pulled into the air, Nick notices something strange above them. Dozens of crows are circling the coffin, moving with it as if they are following it on purpose. The sight feels unnatural, almost like the birds are guarding the sarcophagus or answering to whatever is inside it. Later, Nick, Chris, Jenny, and Colonel Greenway reach a nearby airstrip. In the distance, a massive sandstorm begins forming across the sky, growing larger and darker by the minute. The team quickly loads the sarcophagus onto a military transport plane, then boards the aircraft so they can take it back to England. Once the plane is in the air, Chris's condition starts getting worse. His face looks pale, his movements become stiff, and his behavior grows increasingly strange. But with everything else happening, no one seems to fully understand how serious the situation has become. Meanwhile, Nick tries once again to get closer to Jenny. He finally admits that he may have taken the map from her after their night together in Baghdad, but he insists that his feelings for her are not fake. Jenny does not soften. To her, Nick is still a selfish thief who steals priceless pieces of history and sells them for profit. She sees him as exactly the kind of man who cares more about money than the past. A little later, Jenny begins translating the inscriptions carved into the sarcophagus. The writing tells the story of Aminet's life, her betrayal, her curse, and the dark force connected to her. As Jenny reads, Nick is suddenly pulled into another vision. This time, he sees everything more clearly. He sees Aminet's past, the ritual, and the deal she made with Set. But now there is one terrifying detail he finally understands. He is not just some random person who discovered her prison. Aminet has chosen him as the living body that will allow Set to return to the world of men. Before Nick can process what this means, Chris suddenly gets up. He looks completely different now, almost like he is no longer in control of himself. Holding a knife, he walks straight toward the sarcophagus and tries to force it open. Greenway rushes in to stop him, but Chris turns on him without hesitation and stabs him brutally. Then Chris comes after Nick and the others inside the aircraft. Nick tries to stop his friend, but Chris is too far gone. With no other choice, Nick is forced to raise his weapon and shoot his own partner. At that exact moment, thousands of crows appear outside the plane. They slam into the aircraft with terrifying force, smashing through the windows and tearing into the engines. The plane begins shaking violently as the engines fail one after another. Within seconds, the aircraft loses control and starts plunging toward England. Inside, everything turns into chaos. Alarms blare. The wind roars through the broken windows, and the plane spirals downward as everyone struggles to survive. In the middle of it all, Nick still manages to grab a parachute and strap it onto Jenny. Then, before she can stop him, he pushes her out of the collapsing aircraft, saving her life. But Nick does not make it out. He remains trapped inside the falling plane with the other soldiers as it crashes toward the ground. Moments later, the aircraft goes down, and it seems like everyone left inside has been killed. In the following scene, Jenny is brought to the morgue, where the doctors ask her to help identify the bodies recovered from the plane crash. The atmosphere is cold, silent, and heavy, with the dead laid out around her as she prepares herself for the worst. But at the same time, something impossible happens. Nick suddenly wakes up inside a body bag. He gasps for air, completely disoriented, with no idea where he is or how he survived. Only moments ago, he was trapped inside a military plane as it fell from the sky. Now he is lying among corpses in a morgue, somehow alive. Terrified and confused, he climbs out of the bag and tries to understand what is happening. Then he looks behind him and sees Chris. Chris is standing there calmly, as if nothing happened at all. But Nick knows that cannot be real. Chris died on the plane. Nick himself was forced to shoot him. Shocked, Nick demands to know what is going on, but Chris only smiles in a strange, unsettling way and tells him that he understands everything now. A few moments later, Jenny enters the room with several doctors. The moment she sees Nick standing there alive, she freezes. She can barely process what she is looking at. Nick had already been declared dead after the crash, yet here he is, breathing and walking around as if death somehow rejected him. Soon, it becomes clear that there is something even stranger happening. Nick is the only one who can see Chris. To everyone else in the room, Nick appears to be talking to empty space. Meanwhile, back at the crash site, two police officers are searching through the wreckage. As they inspect the area, one of them discovers Aminet's sarcophagus among the debris. Curiosity gets the better of him, and he opens it. Inside, he finds Aminet's actual mummified body. At first, she looks like a dried, ancient corpse, lifeless and fragile. The officer calls out to his partner, but before the second officer can get close, Amunet suddenly awakens. In a violent burst, she attacks the man and begins draining the life from his body. As his strength fades, hers begins to return. Her form slowly restores itself, piece by piece, as if every life she steals pulls her closer to becoming whole again. She then does the same thing to the second officer. And with that, another terrifying truth is revealed. Anyone killed by Amunet does not simply die. They become her servants, bound to her will and forced to obey whatever she commands. Later, Nick and Jenny go to a bar, both trying to make sense of what has happened. Nick survived a crash that should have killed him instantly, and neither of them can find any normal explanation for it. The more they talk, the more impossible the situation becomes. While piecing together everything they know, Jenny comes up with a disturbing theory. She explains that, long ago, there was an Egyptian princess whose existence was deliberately erased from history. Jenny now believes that this forgotten princess was Amunet. She also tells Nick about a ritual dagger once used by Amunet. The weapon had a magical jewel set into its handle, and together, the dagger and stone were meant to complete the ceremony that would allow Set to enter the world in human form. But according to archaeological records, the jewel was eventually removed from the dagger. The Crusaders stole it, carried it away, and hid it with one of their own knights. Jenny then reveals that an ancient Crusader burial ground has recently been discovered, and she believes the missing jewel may be hidden there. As Jenny explains all of this, Nick keeps seeing Chris nearby. Sometimes he appears across the room. Sometimes he is watching from a corner. No matter where Nick looks, Chris seems to be there, silently following him. The sight becomes too much for Nick, so he excuses himself and goes into the bathroom, trying to calm down and convince himself that none of this is real. But when he looks into the mirror, Chris is there too. Nick starts to believe he may finally be losing his mind, but Chris tells him something even worse. He says they have both been cursed by Amunet, and if Nick refuses to follow the path that has been chosen for him, then everything will only become more painful and dangerous from here. Meanwhile, Jenny secretly contacts Henry and updates him on Nick's condition and the strange events surrounding him. Henry listens carefully, then tells her to bring Nick to him as soon as possible, but he also warns her not to let Nick learn the full truth yet. Still overwhelmed by everything he has seen, Nick wanders outside and ends up in a dark alley. His mind is already unstable, and seconds later, another terrifying vision overtakes him. Amunet appears before him, moving toward him with an eerie calm. Behind her, thousands of rats pour through the alley like a living wave, rushing straight toward Nick. But then the illusion suddenly breaks. In reality, Nick is not in an alley at all. He is standing in the middle of a road, moments away from being hit by an oncoming car. Jenny grabs him just in time and pulls him out of the vehicle's path, saving him from being run over. Shaken, Nick tells Jenny that her theory about Amunet is right. He explains the visions he has been having and how real they feel. Jenny, however, tries to find a more rational explanation. She suggests that the hallucinations could be caused by mercury poisoning from the tomb, but Nick is not convinced. He tells her he needs to see the sarcophagus himself. In his mind, if he can look at Amunet's actual corpse, maybe he can prove that all of this is just happening inside his head. While Nick and Jenny search for answers, Amunet continues hunting. She drains the life from more men, and with each victim, she grows stronger. Her decayed body continues to heal, and her human appearance returns more fully, making her look less like a corpse and more like the powerful princess she once was. Later, Nick and Jenny return to the crash site. Jenny immediately heads toward the sarcophagus, hoping to examine it again and understand what they are dealing with. But Nick is distracted by something else. Nearby, he notices a church, and for reasons he cannot explain, he feels drawn toward it. As he stares at the building, another vision of Amunet flashes before him. When he finally comes back to his senses, Nick realizes he is no longer standing outside. He is already inside the church. Before he can react, Amunet's undead servants appear around him. They close in from every side, and within moments, Nick is surrounded, overpowered, and captured. Inside the church, Amunet finally arrives to complete the ritual that will allow Set to cross into the human world. Her servants have already captured Nick, and everything now seems to be moving exactly the way she planned. She destroys an old statue hidden inside the church, revealing Set's dagger, the weapon meant to complete the dark ceremony. Amunet takes the dagger and moves toward Nick, ready to stab him and turn his body into the vessel for the god of death. But just before she can perform the ritual, she notices something wrong. The jewel from the dagger's handle is missing. The moment she realizes the weapon is incomplete, her calm expression turns into fury. Without that stone, the ritual cannot be finished, and thousands of years of waiting suddenly mean nothing. At that same moment, Jenny enters the church, trying to stop whatever is happening. Amunet immediately turns on her and attacks without hesitation. Nick struggles free as the undead servants close in around them. After fighting back against the mummies and knocking several of them down, Nick rushes to Jenny and pulls her away from Amunet before the two finally manage to escape the church. They jump into a vehicle and speed away, but Jenny quickly notices something disturbing. Nick seems to have some kind of link to Amunet. Whenever she is nearby, his mind pulls him straight toward her, almost like an invisible thread is guiding him to the mummy's location. Nick refuses to believe it, insisting that he is still in control. But only a few moments later, he looks around and realizes the horrifying truth. Without even noticing, he has already turned the vehicle around and started driving back toward the church. That is when Nick finally understands that Amunet is not just haunting him through visions. She is inside his mind, slowly influencing his choices and pulling him toward the destiny she has prepared for him. Nick fights against the control and drives away again, but the escape does not last long. Amunet's undead followers chase after them, forcing the vehicle off course. The pursuit becomes chaotic, and Nick eventually loses control, crashing the car violently. Moments later, Amunet arrives at the wreckage. With almost no effort, she uses her powers to throw Nick down and overpower him. Then she turns her attention toward Jenny, ready to kill her. But before she can finish the attack, a group of armed men suddenly appears. They are carrying specialized weapons designed for supernatural threats, and they open fire, forcing Amunet back and rescuing Jenny from her grasp. The mysterious team manages to capture Amunet, restraining her before she can escape again. Then one of the men walks up to Nick, and before Nick can understand what is happening, the man knocks him unconscious. Later, Nick wakes up inside a strange facility he has never seen before. The place feels like a mix between a high-security laboratory and a hidden museum of forbidden horrors. There, Dr. Henry Jekyll finally introduces himself properly. Henry explains that he is the head of Prodigium, a secret organization created to locate, study, contain, and destroy supernatural dangers across the world. Their mission is to protect humanity from ancient evils, cursed beings, and forces that most people do not even know exist. But Henry is not completely normal himself. He reveals that he is infected with a dark condition that can take control of his body and turn him into something monstrous. To keep that side of himself suppressed, he regularly injects a special serum. Without it, the creature inside him begins to take over. Nick also learns another shocking truth. Jenny has been working with Prodigium for a long time. Her involvement with Amunet's case was never random. She has been watching the situation and reporting back to Henry from the beginning. Henry then shows Nick that Amunet has been captured and locked inside the facility. Her body is chained down, and mercury is being pumped directly into her veins, cutting off her supernatural strength. Henry explains that as the mercury continues moving through her body, it will eventually harden inside her until it destroys her completely. Even in chains, Amunet is not powerless. She speaks to Nick again, reaching into his mind with the same seductive darkness as before. She tells him that if Set fully enters his body, Nick will no longer be a normal man. He will become immortal, with power over life and death itself. She promises him a kingdom beyond anything he can imagine. He will be king, she will be queen, and together they will rule the world. Then Amunet's body begins to burn under the effect of the mercury. Nick knows she is dangerous. He knows she has killed people and plans to bring a god of death into the world. But seeing her suffer still affects him in a way he does not understand. He begs Henry to stop torturing her. That reaction surprises Henry. It also fascinates him, because it proves that the bond between Nick and Amunet is stronger than anyone expected. Meanwhile, at the Crusader Cemetery, Henry's men finally recover the missing jewel from the dagger. The one piece Amunet needs to complete her ritual is now inside Prodigium's facility. At the same time, Amunet speaks to Jenny in a quiet but unsettling way. She reminds her that the dagger, the jewel, and Nick have all been brought to the same place. Then she asks Jenny a simple but dangerous question. What does she think Henry really plans to do with all of them? That question makes Jenny realize the truth. Henry does not simply want to stop Aminette. His plan is far more extreme. He intends to let Set enter Nick's body, giving the god of death a physical human form. Then, once Set becomes mortal, Prodigium will try to kill him permanently. Jenny confronts Henry as soon as she understands his plan, but Henry explains that Nick is already doomed. Because of Aminette's curse, Nick will eventually die no matter what they do. In Henry's mind, using Nick to destroy Set may be the only way to turn his fate into something useful. Nick is furious when he hears this. Desperate to force Henry to find another answer, he grabs Henry's serum and refuses to hand it back unless Henry promises to save him another way. But the decision has immediate consequences. Without the serum, Henry begins to lose control. The darkness inside him rises to the surface, and he transforms into his brutal alter ego, Mr. Hyde. As the room begins sealing itself automatically to trap the monster inside, Jenny and one of the guards manage to escape. Nick, however, is left trapped in the chamber with Hyde. At the same time, Aminette uses her influence to take control of a technician inside the facility. Through him, she breaks free from her restraints, escaping the very prison that was supposed to destroy her. Back in the sealed room, Nick is forced into a violent fight with Mr. Hyde. Hyde is stronger, more vicious, and completely out of control. But after a brutal struggle, Nick manages to overpower him long enough to inject the serum back into his body. The medicine takes effect, and Hyde slowly returns to being Henry again. Soon after, Jenny finds Nick and tells him they have to reach the Crusader Cemetery immediately. The missing jewel must be destroyed before Aminette can get to it. If they break the stone, the dagger will be useless. The ritual cannot be completed, and the curse binding Nick to Aminette may finally end. Nick and Jenny rush toward the cemetery, but Aminette is already unleashing her full power. Across London, the sky darkens as a massive sandstorm begins tearing through the city. Streets vanish beneath waves of dust and debris. Buildings disappear into the storm, and panic spreads everywhere as London is swallowed by the chaos. In the middle of all this destruction, Nick and Jenny get separated. Then, once again, Chris appears in front of Nick. Chris tells Nick to come with him, claiming he knows exactly where the missing jewel has been taken. At first, it seems like he is trying to help, but the truth is very different. Chris has not been guiding Nick towards safety or answers. He has been misleading him from the start, using Nick's trust to pull both him and Jenny straight into Aminette's path. Meanwhile, Aminette begins using her full dark power inside the ancient Crusader cemetery. One by one, she awakens the dead knights buried there, raising their corpses from their resting places and forcing them under her control. The Crusaders who once held tied the jewel are now nothing more than her undead soldiers, and she uses them to search for the stone that will complete Set's dagger. Deep inside the London underground, Jenny suddenly finds herself attacked by Aminette's mummified servants. The creatures come at her through the darkness, but before they can kill her, Nick arrives and fights them off just in time. For a moment, it looks like they might escape, but one of the mummies hurls them through a broken wall. They crash into a hidden section beyond the tunnel, falling into the flooded remains of the ancient cemetery. The underground chamber is dark, ruined, and half-submerged beneath cold water. Nick manages to save Jenny from another mummy that attacks them in the flooded passage, but before they can reach safety, Aminette appears again. Without warning, she grabs Jenny and drags her down beneath the water. Nick dives after them immediately. He searches through the murky water, trying to reach Jenny before it is too late. But the deeper he goes, the harder it becomes to breathe. His lungs begin burning, and he is forced to swim back to the surface for air. The moment he catches his breath, he dives down again, desperate to find her. This time, he sees Jenny's unconscious body floating in the distance, surrounded by Aminette's undead servants. Nick pushes himself forward and almost reaches her, but more mummies rise from the darkness and block his path. They swarm him from every side, trying to drag him down and keep him away from Jenny. Nick fights through them and somehow manages to break free. He outswims the creatures, reaches Jenny, and carries her body back to the surface. But by the time he pulls her out of the water, it is already too late. Jenny is dead. A few moments later, Aminette appears before him. Instead of attacking immediately, she tries to speak to him gently. She tells Nick to let Jenny go, to forget the woman he lost, and to accept her instead. Aminette offers him love, power, and a place beside her as if all of this destruction has been leading to something beautiful. But Nick cannot look away from Jenny's lifeless body. Every second he stares at her, his grief turns deeper and that grief quickly becomes rage. He is no longer afraid of Amanette, he hates her. And without thinking about the danger, he charges straight at her. Amanette easily overpowers him. She is far stronger than he is, and the fight quickly turns against him. But even while being beaten down, Nick manages to get close enough to steal the dagger from her. For a moment, he has the chance to end everything. He raises the dagger, ready to destroy the jewel and stop the ritual forever. But Amanette quickly reminds him of what the dagger can truly give him. If Nick allows Set to enter his body, he will gain power over life and death itself. He will become something beyond human. That is when Nick realizes there may still be one way to save Jenny, so instead of breaking the jewel, he makes a choice no one expects. He stabs himself with the dagger. The power of Set rushes into him, and the god of death begins taking control of his body. For a moment, Nick seems completely changed. Set speaks through him, and he declares his love for Amanette, as if the ritual has finally succeeded and the ancient pact has been completed. But then Nick looks at Jenny's body. The sight of her brings him back. His human side forces its way through the darkness, and Nick regains control before Set can fully consume him. Now carrying the power of the god of death inside him, Nick turns on Amanette. Using Set's own power, he drains the life from her body. Amanette, who had stolen the strength of so many others, is finally destroyed by the very force she tried to unleash. Her body withers and collapses, leaving her dead at last. Then Nick turns back to Jenny. With the same terrifying power, he brings her back to life. Jenny wakes up and slowly realizes she is alive again. The first thing she sees is Amanette's dead body nearby. Confused and shaken, she immediately begins searching for Nick, desperate to understand what happened to him. Eventually, she finds him hiding in a dark corner, but when she tries to come closer, Nick stops her. He tells her not to approach him, at least not yet. He no longer knows what he has become. Part of him is still Nick, but something darker now lives inside him too. He is afraid that if she gets too close, he might hurt her without meaning to. Before leaving, Nick tells Jenny that he truly loves her. He also admits that he wishes they had been given more time together. Then, before she can stop him, he disappears into the shadows. Not long after, Henry and his men arrive, but Nick is already gone. In the final scene, Henry and Jenny discuss what might have happened to him. Henry explains that Nick has become a kind of monster now, but he has not lost himself completely. His humanity is still there, fighting against the darkness inside him. Because of that, Henry believes Nick will probably wander the world, searching for a way to cure the curse and understand what he has become. Meanwhile, in Egypt, Nick is seen preparing for a new journey, and he is not alone. Chris is with him again, now brought back to life through Nick's new power. The two men ride out together across the desert on horseback, heading toward whatever comes next. As they disappear into the distance, a massive sandstorm follows behind Nick, moving with him like a sign of the terrifying power he now carries. I'll be honest, The Mummy 2017 is one of those movies where the disappointment doesn't come from having zero potential. It's actually the opposite. That's what makes it a little more frustrating, because on paper, this should have worked. You have Universal bringing back one of its classic monsters. You have a studio legacy that goes all the way back to those old-school horror films that basically helped shape the genre. You have a recognizable title, a big star in Tom Cruise, a new version of The Mummy, and this whole idea of restarting the Universal monster world for a modern audience. That sounds exciting, right? Even if you were skeptical, there was still a reason to be curious. A modern mummy film could have gone in so many directions. It could have been creepy and atmospheric. It could have leaned into adventure. It could have been a darker supernatural thriller. It could have used the old mythology in a fresh way instead of just repeating what came before. And honestly, the ingredients were there. Ancient curses, buried secrets, a forgotten princess, a tomb hidden in the middle of a war zone, and a monster waking up in the modern world. That is not a bad starting point at all. There's mystery in that. There's danger. There's that classic feeling of humans messing with something they absolutely should have left alone. But then the actual movie starts unfolding, and you slowly realize it doesn't really know what to do with all that potential. It wants to be scary, but not too scary. It wants to be funny, but the jokes don't really land. It wants to be an action movie, but it also wants to feel like a classic monster film. And on top of that, it's trying so hard to set up a bigger universe that the movie in front of us starts feeling like a trailer for other movies that may or may not happen. That's the strange thing about The Mummies. It doesn't feel like a film built from a strong story first. It feels like a film built from a studio plan. You can almost sense the pressure behind it. This wasn't just supposed to be a mummy movie. It was supposed to be the beginning of something huge, the launchpad, the first chapter, the big announcement that Universal's monsters were back. But a movie still has to work as a movie. And that's where this one starts to fall apart. Because instead of giving us a confident, focused monster story, The Mummies keeps pulling itself in different directions. There are moments where you can see the better version hiding underneath, a sharper version, a darker version, maybe even a fun adventure version, but the film never settles down long enough to become any of those things. So, yes, The Mummy had potential, real potential. That's not the issue. The issue is that the final movie takes a strong idea, surrounds it with expensive noise, franchise setup, and confused tone, and somehow makes the whole thing feel smaller than it should have been. For a movie about bringing something ancient back to life, it's oddly missing the one thing it needed most, a pulse. To understand why The Mummies 2017 felt like such a missed opportunity, you kind of have to look at the name it was carrying. This wasn't some random monster movie coming out of nowhere. This was The Mummies, a title connected to one of the oldest horror traditions in Hollywood. Universal didn't just make monster movies back in the day. They helped define what monster movies even looked and felt like. Dracula, Frankenstein, the Wolfman, the Invisible Man, the Mummy, these weren't just creatures, they were icons. And that history matters because when you bring back a title like The Mummies, people are not walking in with a blank mind. Even if they haven't seen every old version, they know the image, the tomb, the curse, the ancient evil, the feeling that something buried for centuries has finally opened its eyes again. The classic Boris Karloff version had that slow, eerie, tragic quality. It wasn't just about a monster chasing people around. There was sadness in it. There was obsession. There was this old horror movie patience that let the atmosphere do a lot of the work. Then later versions took the idea in different directions. Christopher Lee brought his own presence to the character. The Brendan Fraser film from 1999 turned the whole thing into a big adventure, and honestly, that movie knew exactly what it was. It had monsters, comedy, romance, danger, and that old pulpy energy. It wasn't trying to be pure horror, but it had charm, a lot of charm. So when the 2017 film arrives, it's walking into a very crowded tomb, if you want to put it that way. It has to deal with the classic horror legacy. It has to deal with the memory of the 1999 adventure version. And it also has to prove that there is still a reason to bring this monster back again. That's not impossible. Reboots can work when they find a new angle. The problem is, this movie never really figures out what its new angle is supposed to be. It doesn't have the haunting sadness of the old Universal films. It doesn't have the effortless fun of the Brendan Fraser version. It doesn't fully become its own darker modern version either. It just sort of floats between all those possibilities, borrowing a little from each one but never matching the personality of any of them. And that's why the comparisons become unavoidable. Some people say, don't compare it to the older Mummy films. But how can you not? The movie itself invites the comparison. It uses the name, the mythology, the studio legacy, and the promise of bringing back Universal's monsters. Once you do that, you're asking the audience to remember what came before, and what came before had identity. The 2017 film has scale, it has money, it has Tom Cruise running through chaos. It has big effects and a whole cinematic universe being teased in the background. But identity? That's where it struggles. It's not enough to resurrect an old title. You have to understand why people cared about it in the first place. That's the part this movie seems to miss. The old Mummy stories had mystery. They had atmosphere. The 1999 version had adventure and personality. This one has pieces of both. But they're buried under so much franchise pressure that the monster legacy starts feeling more like branding than storytelling. And for a film trying to revive Universal's classic monsters, that's a pretty serious problem. One thing I do understand, at least from the studio's point of view, is that the Mummy is not the easiest monster to modernize. I mean, let's be real for a second. Compared to some of Universal's other monsters, the Mummy has always had a slightly different problem. Dracula has style. Frankenstein's creature has tragedy. The Wolfman has that whole violent transformation angle. Even the Invisible Man has this creepy psychological madness built into him. The Mummy, traditionally, is slower, quieter, more ancient, more about atmosphere than movement. and that can absolutely work. In fact, that's what makes The Mummy interesting when it's handled properly. The fear is not supposed to come from speed. It's supposed to come from the idea that something dead, something buried, something that should have stayed forgotten, is now awake again. That's creepy. But the 2017 movie seems almost nervous about that. It feels like the filmmakers looked at The Mummy and thought, okay, audiences today won't be scared of a slow ancient corpse, so we need to make this huge. So instead of letting the horror breathe, they throw everything at the screen. We get zombies, we get sandstorms, we get explosions, we get plane crashes, we get big CGI destruction, we get action scenes stacked on top of action scenes. The movie keeps trying to convince us that this version of the Mummy is more dangerous because everything around her is louder and faster. But louder is not the same as scarier. That's where the film makes one of its biggest mistakes. It tries to solve the Mummy problem by turning the story into a blockbuster spectacle when what it really needed was patience, suspense, mood, that uncomfortable feeling that something ancient has entered the modern world, and nobody fully understands what they've disturbed. Instead, the movie keeps pushing for scale. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying a Mummy movie can't have action. The 1999 film proved that it can. But that movie had a clear adventure tone. It knew it was fun, pulpy, and larger than life. This version wants the same energy, but it also wants to be darker and more serious, so the action ends up fighting against the horror instead of supporting it. Princess Amenette should feel like this ancient curse slowly poisoning the world around her. But a lot of the time, the film treats her like the center of a disaster movie. She raises bodies, creates chaos, throws sand around, and sends undead followers after people. Yet somehow, the more the movie shows, the less mysterious she becomes. That's the irony. The film gives the Mummy more power, more movement, and more visual effects, but it doesn't make her more frightening. It makes her busier. And that's a very modern blockbuster problem. Sometimes studios think that if a monster is not scary enough, the answer is to make everything bigger. Bigger powers, bigger scenes, bigger destruction. But horror doesn't always grow with size. Sometimes it actually shrinks, because the scariest version of this story probably wasn't the one with the most CGI. It was the one where the movie trusted the silence of the tomb, the weight of the curse, and the slow realization that this thing from the past has chosen you. That's the version The Mummies almost seems afraid to become. So the basic setup of The Mummies is not actually bad. That's the funny thing. The movie starts with Nick Morton, played by Tom Cruise, and his friend Chris Vail, played by Jake Johnson. They're attached to the military, but they're also doing this shady side hustle where they hunt for ancient artifacts and try to profit from whatever they can find. So right away, Nick is not introduced as some noble hero. He's more of a reckless treasure thief who happens to be wearing a uniform. And honestly, that could have been interesting. A selfish guy digging up something he doesn't understand, disturbing a tomb he has no respect for, and then being punished by an ancient curse. That's classic monster movie material. That is exactly the kind of setup that should work for a Mummy story. Then we get Jenny Halsey, the archaeologist who has a history with Nick and also knows much more about what they've uncovered. The discovery leads them to the tomb of Princess Amenette, an Egyptian royal who was erased from history after making a pact with Set, the god of death. She was mummified alive, buried far away from Egypt, and locked away so the world would never have to face what she had become. Again, that sounds strong. You have a cursed princess, you have a stolen tomb, you have a morally questionable lead, you have a dangerous artifact, you have the idea that this ancient evil was hidden so carefully that even finding it feels like a mistake. But once Amenette is unleashed, the movie starts adding more and more layers before the main story has really settled. Nick gets cursed. Chris comes back as this ghostly warning figure. Amenette wants to use Nick as part of a ritual connected to Set. Jenny is trying to stop the situation from getting worse. Then Dr. Henry Jekyll enters the picture with Prodigium, this secret organization that studies and contains supernatural threats. And that's where the premise starts feeling crowded, because the core story is simple enough. A man awakens a cursed mummy, becomes tied to her plan, and has to stop her before she brings something terrible into the world. That's clean. That's easy to follow. That gives you room for horror, action, character conflict, and atmosphere. But The Mummy does not trust that simple version. It keeps expanding sideways. Suddenly, we're not just dealing with Amenette and Nick. We're dealing with ancient gods, secret societies, monster research, Jekyll and Hyde. future franchise hints, and a whole cinematic universe being quietly pushed into the frame. The problem is not that these ideas are automatically bad. Some of them are actually pretty cool in theory. A secret organization that tracks monsters? That could work. Dr. Jekyll existing in the same world as the mummy? Also interesting. A cursed soldier becoming the chosen vessel for an ancient evil? There's a movie in that. But when all of it is thrown together at once, the main story starts losing focus. You can feel the film trying to make the premise bigger, but bigger does not always mean better. Sometimes a monster movie just needs a strong curse, a dangerous creature, and characters who slowly realize they are way out of their depth. That version of the mummy is somewhere inside this movie. You can see it in pieces. The tomb discovery, Amanet's backstory, Nick realizing he has been chosen, Jenny trying to understand what they've awakened. Those parts give the film a real foundation. But then the movie keeps stacking extra mythology on top of it, and, by the time Dr. Jekyll is explaining monster organizations and future threats, the mummy herself starts feeling like only one part of a much larger sales pitch. And that's a shame, because the premise didn't need that much decoration, it just needed focus. One thing I actually don't mind about The Mummy's 2017 is the decision to move the story into the modern day. That part, at least in theory, makes sense. Because if you're bringing this franchise back again, you probably don't want to just repeat the same old desert adventure setup exactly as people remember it. We've already had the classic tombs, the old expeditions, the period piece atmosphere, the early 20th century adventure feeling. That stuff can still work, of course. But for a reboot, I get why they wanted a new environment. So placing the discovery in Iraq, tying it to a military operation, and then dragging that ancient evil into modern England, that's not a terrible idea. There's something interesting about a curse from thousands of years ago suddenly colliding with the modern world. Soldiers, aircraft, city tunnels, secret organizations, archaeology mixed with warfare. You can see the appeal. And for a few moments, the movie almost uses that idea well. The tomb being found in the middle of a modern conflict zone gives the story a different texture. It's not just explorers brushing sand off some lost Egyptian ruin. It's people stumbling onto something ancient while surrounded by gunfire, military pressure, and chaos they already barely control. That contrast could have been really effective. Modern weapons, modern arrogance, modern systems, all completely useless against something older than any of them. That's a strong angle. Even moving part of the story to London has potential. Ancient evil underneath a modern city is a pretty good horror image. You have trains, tunnels, construction sites, old history buried under new infrastructure. There's a nice idea there that the modern world is not as clean or safe as it thinks it is. Under all the concrete and lights, there are still buried things waiting. But again, the movie doesn't really settle into that idea long enough. It uses the modern setting more as scenery than atmosphere. Iraq becomes a place for action. London becomes a place for chases and exposition. The underground spaces are there. The ancient modern contrast is there. But the film rarely slows down enough to let that contrast feel eerie. And that's the frustrating part. The setting could have helped make this version stand apart from the older films. It could have given the movie a reason to exist beyond just, here's the mummies, but newer. Instead, the modern backdrop mostly gets folded into the same loud blockbuster rhythm. The military angle could have been used to show how badly modern power misunderstands ancient danger. The archaeology angle could have created mystery. The London tunnels could have become creepy, claustrophobic spaces. Even the idea of transporting Amanet's sarcophagus across borders could have carried this growing sense that something terrible is being moved through systems that are not prepared for it. But most of that stays on the surface. The film has the right ingredients, but it keeps rushing past the flavor. It wants the cool image of a mummy in the modern world, but it doesn't fully explore what that actually means. How does an ancient curse feel different when it wakes up in a world of aircraft, surveillance, soldiers, and underground transport? How does old evil adapt to new civilization? How does the modern world react when something completely outside science and control appears? Those are interesting questions. The movie mostly answers them with running, shouting, CGI, and Tom Cruise looking confused. So yes, the modern setting was not the problem. If anything, it was one of the better instincts behind the reboot. It gave the film a chance to separate itself from the earlier versions and create a new kind of mummy story. The problem is that the movie treats the setting like a background upgrade instead of a storytelling engine, and that's why it feels like another missed opportunity. The film moved the mummy into the present, but it never really made the present feel haunted. Now, one of the more interesting choices this movie makes is turning the mummy into Princess Amenet. And honestly, I don't think that idea is bad at all. In fact, that might be one of the smartest instincts the reboot had. Because if you're going to bring the mummies back again, you need something that separates it from the older versions. You can't just wrap another ancient man in bandages, give him a curse, and expect everyone to feel like they're seeing something new. So making the mummy a betrayed princess actually gives the story a different kind of energy. Amenet is not just some random monster buried in a tomb. She is royalty. She is someone who believed power was supposed to belong to her. Then, that power was taken away. Her place in history was erased, and she was punished in the most horrifying way possible. Buried alive, hidden from the world, and left to rot in silence. That's a strong monster origin. There's anger in that, there's humiliation, there's ambition. There's this idea that the monster is not just evil because the movie needs a villain, but because she was created through betrayal, obsession, and a violent hunger for control. That could have been fascinating. A female mummy also changes the atmosphere a little. It gives the film room to play with seduction, rage, royal arrogance, and ancient power in a way that feels different from the usual version of the character. Amenet could have been tragic and terrifying at the same time, someone you fear, but also someone whose fall you understand. And Sofia Boutella is clearly capable of carrying that. You can see it in her eyes, in the way she moves, in the way she gives Amenet this cold confidence. Even before the film fully explains her, she feels like someone who has waited a very long time to take back what she thinks belongs to her. But this is where the frustration comes in. The movie introduces a fresh version of the mummy, and then it doesn't really commit to her. It treats the gender change like a major update, but it does not build enough story around what that update actually means. Amenet has a great visual presence, a strong backstory, and a clear motive on the surface, but the film keeps dragging attention away from her. Instead of making her the emotional and mythic center of the movie, the story keeps shifting toward Nick Morton, his curse, his visions, his transformation, his destiny, his heroic decision. And after a while, you start to feel it. This movie has a really interesting monster, but it is more interested in what that monster does to Tom Cruise. That is such a strange choice, because Amenet should be the reason the film exists. Her story should be the dark engine underneath everything. The movie should make us feel the weight of her burial, her rage, her return, and the danger of her ambition. Instead, she becomes part villain, part plot device, part franchise ingredient. There are flashes where the concept works. Her first appearances have some menace. Her design is striking. Her physical presence gives the film a sharper edge. But the actual writing never digs deep enough into her as a character, so the female mummy concept is not the problem. The problem is that the movie has a fresh idea and then handles it like decoration. It changes the monster, but it doesn't fully rethink the story around her. And that's why Amenet ends up feeling like one of the film's biggest missed opportunities. Not because the idea is weak, because the idea is strong enough that you can feel the better movie trying to break through. If there is one thing in The Mummies that almost everyone can agree on, it's that Sofia Boutella understood the assignment better than the movie around her did. She is easily one of the strongest parts of the film, and I don't just mean that in the usual the villain was cool kind of way. Boutella brings something very specific to Amenet. There's a sharpness to her, a stillness. Even when the movie is throwing noise and effects everywhere, she has this controlled presence that makes her feel more interesting than a lot of the chaos happening around her. Her eyes do a lot of work. That sounds like a small thing, but in a monster movie, it matters. Amenet is supposed to feel ancient, angry, seductive, and dangerous all at once, and Boutella manages to suggest all of that without needing huge speeches. Sometimes she just looks at someone, and you get the feeling that this is not a person anymore. This is someone who has been buried with hatred for centuries and has come back with a very clear purpose. That's the kind of performance this movie needed more of. Because whenever Amenet is allowed to simply exist on screen, not buried under too much exposition, not turned into a CGI storm, not pushed aside for franchise setup, the film becomes more watchable. Boutella gives her a physical language. The way she moves is not random monster acting. There's something elegant but broken about it. Something royal but corrupted. You can feel the princess and the corpse in the same body, and that is genuinely interesting. She also gives the character a kind of confidence that makes Amunet feel powerful even when the script doesn't fully support her. The writing often reduces her to a villain with a ritual plan, but Boutella plays her like someone who still believes the world owes her a throne. She is not begging for power. She thinks she already deserves it. That attitude gives the character texture. The frustrating part is that the film does not seem to realize what it has. It has an actress who can carry menace, physicality, beauty, rage, and tragedy in the same role, but instead of building the movie around that, it keeps cutting back to Nick Morton's confusion, Jekyll's explanations, and the larger dark universe machinery. So Amunet becomes the best part of the movie and somehow still feels underused. That's not Boutella's fault. If anything, she is doing more than the material gives her. She takes a role that could have easily become just another CGI monster and gives it a human shape, even if it's a deeply cursed one. And honestly, when people talk about the missed potential of The Mummy, this is a big part of it. Sofia Boutella's Amunet could have been the center of a much stronger film, a darker film, a weirder film, one that actually cared about the monster as a character, instead of treating her like the thing that pushes the hero toward his next plot point. But even in this version, even with all the clutter around her, she leaves an impression, not enough to save the whole movie maybe, but enough to make you wish the movie had followed her more closely. The weird thing about The Mummy is that the movie has its most interesting character right there in the title, and then somehow keeps treating her like a side effect. Amunet should be the center of this whole thing. Not just because she's the monster, but because her story has the most dramatic weight. She is the one with the ancient history. She is the one who was erased, punished, buried, and left to become something horrifying. She is the reason the curse exists. She is the reason the tomb matters. She is the reason the modern world is suddenly in danger. But the film keeps drifting away from her. Instead of really digging into Amunet's rage, her betrayal, her hunger for power, and what centuries of burial did to her, the movie becomes more interested in Nick Morton's experience of the curse. We spend more time watching him react to visions, panic about what is happening to him, and slowly get pulled into this chosen one situation than we do, actually understanding the monster driving the story. And that feels backwards. Because Nick is not unworkable as a protagonist. A selfish treasure hunter getting cursed by the very thing he disturbed is a solid idea. But the movie starts treating his transformation like the main event, while Amunet becomes the force pushing him toward that transformation. She stops feeling like the dark heart of the film and starts feeling like a supernatural device attached to Nick's character arc. That is a big reason the movie loses power. A stronger version of this story would have made Amunet feel unavoidable. Every scene should have pulled us closer to her history, her madness, her pain, and her plan. The audience should have felt like this ancient princess was slowly taking control of the film itself. Instead, she keeps getting interrupted by comic relief, action scenes, Jekyll's explanations, and all the dark universe setup. And the frustrating part is, the foundation is already there. A princess who loses her future. A woman who turns to a death god because she refuses to be forgotten. A royal figure punished so brutally that her tomb becomes less like a grave and more like a prison. That's not just monster material, that's character material. But the film only uses it in broad strokes. We get the basic explanation, yes, we understand what she wants on the surface. But we do not really sit with her. We do not feel the full tragedy of her fall, or the full horror of her resurrection. We do not get enough of the psychological side of her curse. She should feel ancient and personal at the same time, but the movie mostly keeps her at the level of dangerous villain with a ritual. And Sofia Boutella is clearly ready to do more. That's what makes it worse. You can see in her performance that Amunet could have carried a much more focused film. She has the look, the presence, the physical control, the menace. There are little moments where she seems like she belongs to a darker, more elegant monster movie than the one we're actually watching. But then the movie pulls back to Nick. Nick's fear, Nick's destiny, Nick's heroic choice, Nick's future. After a while, Amunet almost feels like she's competing with the lead actor for space in her own movie. And that is not a good sign when the film is literally called The Mummies. This is where the reboot's priorities become really clear. It wants to use Amunet to create a new kind of monster, but it also wants Tom Cruise to remain the center of gravity. It wants a frightening villain, but it also wants a hero origin story. It wants ancient evil, but it also wants franchise setup. So Amunet ends up caught in the middle. She is too visually strong to ignore, but too underwritten to fully dominate. too important to the plot to be minor, but not explored enough to become tragic or unforgettable. She has the shape of a great monster, but the movie never gives her the space to become one. And honestly, that might be the biggest missed opportunity in the entire film. Because when people remember this movie at all, they usually remember the idea of Amunet more than the actual story around her. That tells you something. The concept had power. The performance had power. The design had power. The movie just didn't know how to stay with her. One area where I do think The Mummies deserves some credit is the actual design of Amunet, because visually, she works. Not every effect around her works, and not every scene uses her well, but the basic look of the character is strong. There's thought in it. You can tell the team didn't just throw some bandages on Sofia Boutella and call it a day. Her appearance has texture, it has details. It has a kind of cracked, ancient beauty that fits the idea of a princess who has been buried, cursed, and dragged back into the world wrong. The eyes are probably the first thing people remember. They give her this unnatural, predatory look, and they help separate her from just being another undead creature. There's something sharp and almost hypnotic about them. It's a simple visual hook, but it works. Then you have the bandages, the markings, the damaged skin, the nails, the way her body looks both preserved and broken. Those little details matter in a monster movie. They give the character a physical identity. They make her feel like something designed, not just generated. And when the film lets that design sit on screen for a moment, Amunet has real presence. That's why I wish the movie trusted the makeup and physical performance more often. Because the more human, practical, and tactile she feels, the more interesting she becomes. Sofia Boutella already has such a controlled physical style that the design adds to her performance instead of replacing it. You can see the monster through the actress, and that is usually more compelling than just turning everything into a digital effect. The problem is that the movie sometimes gets in its own way. There are scenes where the lighting is so dark that it actually hides the work. And that's frustrating, because if you've gone through the trouble of creating a detailed creature design, let us see it. Darkness can create atmosphere, sure, but there's a difference between moody and muddy. Sometimes The Mummies crosses that line. Then there's the CGI. Again, it's not all terrible, some of it looks decent. But the more the movie turns Amunet into a storm of effects, the less unique she feels. The makeup gives her personality. The physical design gives her history. The digital spectacle turns her into just another blockbuster threat. And that's a shame, because the creature design is one of the few parts of the film that actually feels like it understands the assignment. Amunet should look beautiful and horrifying at the same time. Royal, but rotten. Ancient, but alive. Human enough to suggest tragedy. Monstrous enough to suggest danger. And in her best moments, that's exactly what the design gives us. The costumes and styling help with that too. There's a regal quality to her, even when she's decayed. She doesn't just look like a corpse that crawled out of a tomb. She looks like someone who once belonged to a throne and still believes she does. That little detail is important, because monster design is not just about looking cool. It should tell us something about the character before they even speak. And Amunet's design tells us quite a bit. It tells us she was powerful. It tells us she was punished. It tells us she has been trapped between death and ambition for a very long time. So yes, for all the movie's problems, the makeup, costume work, hair, and creature design are not the issue. If anything, they are part of the reason Amunet stands out as much as she does. The film around her may be confused, but the look of the monster? That part has a clear idea. Now let's talk about the horror side of The Mummy, because this is where the movie really starts to show one of its biggest weaknesses. It has horror elements. Definitely. There are ancient curses, undead bodies, creepy tombs, strange visions, decaying corpses, supernatural rituals, and that whole idea of someone being chosen by a dead princess for something much worse than death. On paper, that sounds like it should be scary. But the movie rarely feels scary. And that's the strange thing. It keeps presenting horror imagery, but it doesn't really build horror atmosphere. There's a difference. You can put a corpse on screen, you can add a jump scare, you can have zombies crawl out of the dark, but if the movie doesn't create tension before that moment, it just becomes another thing happening. That happens a lot here. The film is full of scary-looking ingredients, but not enough actual fear. The undead followers should feel disturbing. Amunet's curse should feel like something slowly eating away at Nick's reality. The tomb should feel like a place that was never meant to be opened. But most of the time, The movie rushes past those feelings because it's too busy moving into the next action scene, joke, or plot explanation. And when the horror does show up, it often feels predictable. You can sense the jump scares coming. You can feel the rhythm of the scene before it lands. Someone walks into a dark space, the sound drops, the camera waits, and then, boom, something appears. It's not terrible every time, but it rarely catches you off guard. The best horror in a mummy story should come from dread. That slow realization that the past has not stayed buried, that the thing you found was hidden for a reason, that the curse is not just chasing you physically, it is closing around your life, your mind, your body, your future. That kind of fear needs patience. But The Mummy does not have much patience. It wants the image of horror without fully committing to the feeling of horror. It shows us ghouls and curses, but it doesn't let them linger. It brings in creepy visuals, then interrupts them with comedy. It starts building mood, then suddenly shifts into big blockbuster movement. That tonal switching hurts the scares badly, because if a movie wants us to be unsettled, it has to protect that mood. It has to let the silence sit for a second. It has to let the danger feel uncertain. Here, every time the atmosphere begins to thicken, the film either explains too much, cuts too fast, or throws in a joke that lets the pressure out. Even Aminette's more frightening abilities don't always land as strongly as they should. Her kiss of death, her control over bodies, her ability to bring the dead back, those are all good monster ideas. But the film uses them more like visual effects moments than true horror moments. They are cool concepts, but they don't get under your skin. And that's probably the biggest issue. The movie is not completely empty of creepy moments. There are a few images that work. Some of the undead imagery has a nice, nasty quality. Aminette herself can be unsettling when the movie lets Sofia Boutella's presence do the work. Early on, especially before everything becomes too loud, there are glimpses of a darker film trying to appear. But it never fully takes over. Instead, the horror keeps getting softened. The action makes it less intimate. The comedy makes it less serious. The CGI makes it less physical. The exposition makes it less mysterious. So what you end up with is a movie that technically contains horror, but rarely creates fear. And for a film carrying the name The Mummies, that's a real problem. Because this story should feel cursed. It should feel ancient. It should feel like death has reached out of history and grabbed the modern world by the throat. Instead, most of the time, it just feels like a loud adventure movie with horror decorations. A big reason The Mummies never becomes truly frightening is because the movie keeps choosing size over suspense. And I get why that happened. This was a big studio reboot with Tom Cruise in the lead. It was never going to be a quiet little horror film with people whispering in tombs for 2 hours. There was always going to be action. There was always going to be spectacle. That part is expected, but the problem is how much the movie relies on it. Every time the story has a chance to slow down and become creepy, it almost seems afraid of the silence. So instead of letting the curse feel strange or letting Aminette's presence slowly build, the film goes bigger. More movement, more running, more collapsing buildings, more undead bodies, more sand, more CGI. After a while, it stops feeling like horror and starts feeling like a supernatural disaster movie, and that can be fun in the right film. I'm not against spectacle. A mummy movie can absolutely have large-scale action. The 1999 version proved that pretty clearly. But that movie had a pulpy adventure rhythm. This one keeps pretending it wants to be darker and more threatening, while also constantly interrupting that darkness with blockbuster noise. That's where the tension gets lost. Suspense usually comes from not knowing exactly what's coming. It comes from waiting, from uncertainty, from watching a character walk deeper into something they do not understand. But The Mummies often skips that stage. It rushes straight to the chaos. Instead of making us fear Aminette, the movie keeps showing us what she can do in big, obvious ways. She summons bodies, she throws people around, she creates destruction, she sends sandstorms ripping through the city, and yes, those things tell us she is powerful, but they do not automatically make her scary. Power is not the same as fear. A monster can destroy a building and still not be frightening. Sometimes the smaller thing is scarier. A voice in the dark, a hand moving inside a coffin, a curse slowly changing someone from the inside. That kind of horror sticks because it feels personal. It feels like there is nowhere to run. But this film keeps turning the threat outward. The danger becomes visual, noisy, and external. It is less about dread and more about impact, less about atmosphere and more about effects, and the CGI is a big part of that. Some of the effects are fine. I don't want to act like the whole movie looks cheap, because it doesn't. There are sequences that clearly have money and effort behind them. But when the movie leans too hard on digital spectacle, Amanette starts losing that physical, ancient quality that makes her interesting. She becomes less of a cursed presence and more of a visual effects event. That weakens the mood. The best moments with her are usually the ones where the film lets Sofia Boutella's body, makeup, and stillness do the work. When she feels present in the room, when she feels like something actually standing there, the movie has a stronger pulse. But when everything becomes sand, smoke, zombies, and digital destruction, the uniqueness starts to fade. It becomes another modern blockbuster climax machine. And that's frustrating because the material did not need to be that loud all the time. A mummy story already has built-in suspense, the tomb, the curse, the forbidden ritual, the idea that the dead are not resting. The fear that by opening one sealed place, you have invited something ancient into the world. That's enough. You don't have to keep proving the monster is dangerous by making everything explode. You have to make the audience feel like the curse is closing in. That's what The Mummy misses. It keeps giving us action when it should be building pressure. It keeps giving us CGI when it should be letting the atmosphere breathe. It keeps expanding the threat until it becomes less intimate, less mysterious, and honestly, less scary. So yes, the film has energy, it has movement, it has expensive-looking moments. But suspense? Not nearly enough. And for a monster movie, that trade-off hurts. Now, to be fair, not every action scene in The Mummy falls flat. There is one sequence that pretty much everyone remembers, and honestly, it deserves the attention it gets, the plane crash. That scene works. It's probably the one moment where the movie's big blockbuster instincts actually line up with the story. Amanette's curse has been unleashed, things are spiraling out of control, and suddenly the characters are trapped inside this aircraft as everything goes completely wrong. The zero-gravity effect gives the scene a physical chaos that feels different from the usual running and exploding action we get in a lot of these movies. For a few minutes, the film has real energy. You feel the panic, you feel the space collapsing around the characters. Bodies are floating, debris is moving everywhere, nobody has control, and the danger actually feels immediate. It's not just Tom Cruise runs from something. It has a clean visual idea, and the movie commits to it, and that's probably why it stands out so much. Because a lot of the other action in the film does not have that same clarity. There are chases, fights, explosions, undead attacks, and supernatural destruction, but many of them blur together. They're loud, they're busy, they're expensive-looking, but they don't always feel exciting. That's the difference between action that is technically happening and action that actually grabs you. The plane crash has a hook. You understand the danger instantly. You understand where the characters are. You understand why they can't escape easily. The whole sequence has shape. Beginning, escalation, chaos, consequence. A lot of the later action feels more scattered than that. The movie often throws movement at the screen without giving it the same sense of tension. People run through dark spaces. Amanette sends things after them. The undead show up. Sandstorms appear. Nick gets pushed into another impossible situation. But because the film has already established this larger-than-life action logic, it becomes harder to feel the stakes, especially with Nick. He survives so much that, after a while, the danger starts feeling weirdly harmless. You know the movie is going to put him through crashes, attacks, curses, and chaos, but you also know he'll probably walk away with surprisingly little damage. That doesn't make the action more thrilling. It makes it feel safer than it should. And that's a problem because action needs consequence. Even in a big supernatural adventure, you need to feel that the characters are paying a price. The plane sequence works partly because it feels like something has genuinely gone wrong. The movie briefly loses control in a good way. You're not just watching spectacle, you're watching disaster hit the story. But after that, the film struggles to top it. Instead of building action scenes around strong ideas, it often builds them around noise, and noise fades quickly. You might remember the plane crash because it has a specific identity, but how many other set pieces really stay with you afterward? Not many. That's why the action side of The Mummy is frustrating. The movie proves, at least once, that it can deliver a strong blockbuster sequence. It proves there was some imagination there. It proves the film did not have to be flat or forgettable. But one great action scene can't carry the whole movie. If anything, the plane crash almost makes the rest of the film look weaker because it shows what the movie could do when it had focus. It had danger, it had momentum, it had a clear concept. Then later, it goes back to throwing CGI chaos around and hoping that scale will be enough. And scale is not enough. The best action scenes are not just big. They are designed, they have rhythm, they have geography, they have stakes. They make the audience understand what is being lost, what is being risked, and why the moment matters. The plane crash has that. Too much of the rest of The Mummy doesn't. Visually, The Mummy is a strange one because it's not an ugly movie, not really. There are moments where you can tell a lot of money and effort went into it. Some of the locations have scale, some of the sets look genuinely impressive. The tomb and prison designs have a nice ancient meets modern quality, and every now and then the movie gives you an image that feels like it belongs in a much better monster film. That's what makes the visual side a little frustrating, because the pieces are there. The movie has production value. It has big sets, polished lighting, huge effect shots, detailed creature work, and the kind of blockbuster finish you expect from a studio release. It doesn't look cheap in the way some rushed franchise starters can look cheap, but it also doesn't always look memorable. A lot of the film has this overly processed, modern blockbuster sheen where everything is technically polished but not especially atmospheric. You're watching something expensive, but you're not always watching something with personality. And for a monster movie, personality matters a lot. The old Universal horror films had shadows, they had mood. Even when they were simple, they had a visual identity. The 1999 Mummies had that golden desert adventure look, very pulpy, very exaggerated, but it knew what world it wanted to create. This version feels more inconsistent. Sometimes it wants to be gritty military action. Sometimes it wants to be gothic horror. Sometimes it wants to be sleek franchise sci-fi with prodigium. Sometimes it becomes full CGI disaster spectacle. None of those looks are automatically bad. The problem is that they don't always feel like they belong to the same film. The editing adds to that. At times, the movie cuts too fast for its own good. Instead of letting a creepy image sit, or letting the environment build tension, it moves quickly into the next beat. That works better in action scenes than in horror scenes. Horror needs a little space. It needs the audience to notice what's wrong before the characters do. But The Mummy often seems impatient. It keeps pushing forward. And that makes some of the visual work feel less effective than it should. You can have a good set, a strong creature design, a creepy location. But if the film doesn't give those things time, they become background texture instead of atmosphere. The cinematography has its moments. There are slick shots, some nice framing, and a few scenes where the scale of the world comes through. The plane sequence, again, is probably the best example of the film's visual ideas actually working with the story. The camera understands the chaos there. The movement has purpose. The danger is readable. But elsewhere, the style can become too busy or too dim. Some scenes are so dark that the details start disappearing, and that's a real issue when one of your strongest assets is creature design and makeup. If the audience can't properly see the work, the atmosphere doesn't automatically become scarier. Sometimes, it just becomes harder to read. Then there's the CGI. Some of it is perfectly fine, some of it even looks good. But the film uses so much digital spectacle that it starts to lose texture. Aminette feels most interesting when she has a physical presence, when the makeup, costume, and Sofia Boutella's performance are doing the heavy lifting. When the film turns everything into sandstorms, undead crowds, and large-scale destruction, it starts feeling more generic. That's the visual pattern of the whole movie, really. The smaller, more specific images tend to work better than the huge ones. The mummy standing in a room, the details of her face, the tomb opening, the strange prison space, the eerie suggestion of something ancient hidden under modern life. Those are the images that feel closest to horror. But the movie keeps chasing bigger visuals, and bigger is not always better, especially here. The more the film expands, the less unique it often becomes. So technically, yes, The Mummy's competently made, in some places, more than competently. The production design has real work behind it. The cinematography has some polished moments. The sound and visual finish give it the surface of a major release. But the style never fully comes together into one strong identity. It looks expensive. It just doesn't always feel alive. One small thing that becomes surprisingly annoying in The Mummy is how often the movie hides its own best visual work. And I don't mean that every scene is impossible to see. It's not one of those movies where you're staring at a black screen the whole time wondering what's happening. But there are definitely moments where the lighting gets so dark or so muddy that the details start disappearing. That matters more here than it would in some other film, because one of the better parts of The Mummies is the design work. Amanette's makeup, her skin texture, her bandages, her eyes, the strange preserved but decayed quality of her body. That stuff is actually interesting. It gives the monster a physical personality. You can tell people worked on that look. So when the movie puts her in scenes where you can barely appreciate those details, it feels like a waste. Darkness can be powerful in horror, obviously. Shadows are part of the language. Sometimes what you don't see is scarier than what you do see, but that only works when the darkness is being used with intention. It should create mystery, not visual confusion. There's a difference between atmosphere and murkiness. A scene can be dim and still readable. It can be shadowy and still textured. It can hide parts of the monster while showing just enough to make your imagination do the rest. That's the sweet spot. But The Mummy doesn't always hit that. Sometimes the darkness just flattens the image. Instead of making Amanette feel more frightening, it makes the makeup and production design harder to notice. And when a movie already struggles to create real horror, losing visual clarity does not help. It's frustrating because the film clearly wants a darker look. It wants to feel more serious than the 1999 version. It wants that modern, gloomy, blockbuster tone. But there are moments where that style works against the movie's own strengths. The creature design is not something you should be embarrassed to show. The tomb and prison spaces have details worth seeing. The costumes and textures matter. If you're going to build a monster world, let the audience actually absorb it. And again, darkness itself is not the problem. The problem is that the movie sometimes uses darkness like a shortcut for atmosphere, as if making the frame dim automatically makes the scene scarier. But horror doesn't work that way. A dark frame is not the same thing as dread. A shadowy room is not automatically suspenseful. You still need timing, framing, sound, and a sense of danger. Without that, the image just becomes dull. Some of the best monster visuals in film history are not effective because they hide everything. They are effective because they know exactly what to reveal, when to reveal it, and how long to let the audience look. The Mummy has enough design work to benefit from that kind of confidence, but it often rushes or obscures instead. So this is not the biggest flaw in the film, but it does connect to a larger issue. The movie has pieces that work. It has a strong-looking monster. It has sets with scale. It has textures that could support a better atmosphere. But it doesn't always present them in a way that lets them breathe. And when a film keeps hiding the few things it actually gets right, you start to feel the missed opportunity even more. To be fair to The Mummy, this is not a movie where you look at it and think nobody tried. That's actually part of what makes it frustrating. There is real craftsmanship here. You can see it in the sets, in the creature design, in the stunt work, in the makeup, in the physical effort of the cast, and in some of the bigger action moments. This is not some cheap, careless production that was thrown together with no resources. It has money behind it, yes, but it also has people clearly working hard in different departments to make the thing feel large and polished. The sets, for example, are often better than the movie around them. The tomb spaces, the prison-like design around Amanette, the prodigium environment. There are details in those places that suggest a more interesting world. You can imagine a version of this film that slows down and lets those environments become part of the atmosphere. The costume and makeup teams also deserve credit. Amanette's design gives the movie one of its few genuinely memorable visual ideas. The bandages, the cracked skin, the eyes, the way she looks both royal and ruined. That stuff works. It gives Sofia Boutella something physical to build on, and she uses it well. And then there's the stunt work. Whatever problems the movie has, you can't really accuse the actors of sleepwalking through the physical side of it. There is movement everywhere. Running, fighting, falling, crashing, being thrown around. It is a very physical movie. Tom Cruise obviously brings that action star commitment, but the rest of the cast also has to deal with a lot of chaos around them. The plane sequence is the easiest example, but it's not the only moment where you can sense the technical team pushing to create scale. The sound design, the visual effects, the practical elements, the camera movement, all of that is trying to sell a big supernatural adventure. And sometimes it does. There are moments where the movie looks and sounds like exactly what Universal probably wanted, a polished, expensive, modern monster blockbuster. Big images, heavy sound, glossy action, famous actors, ancient evil, and enough spectacle to fill a trailer. But that's also where the problem becomes clear. Craft is not the same as cohesion. A movie can have good makeup, strong sets, decent effects, committed stunt work, and still not come together emotionally or narratively. And that is basically what happens here. The individual departments are often doing their jobs. The issue is that they are serving a film that never fully knows what it wants to be, so you end up appreciating pieces instead of being absorbed by the whole. You notice the design of Aminette because the story around her is underwritten. You remember the plane crash because so many other action scenes fade away. You admire the production value because the atmosphere never becomes strong enough to make you forget you're watching production value. That's a weird place for a movie to be. It's technically competent enough that you can't dismiss it as lazy, but it's also creatively confused enough that all the competence starts to feel like wasted effort. There are talented people here building costumes, lighting sets, creating effects, staging action, composing shots, and all of that work is being poured into a movie that keeps pulling itself apart. That's why The Mummy feels less like a total disaster and more like a badly aimed one. It has skill, it has polish, it has resources, it has flashes of imagination. But those things are not being guided by a strong enough vision, and in a monster movie, vision matters more than scale. You can have the best-looking tomb in the world, but if the curse inside it doesn't feel dangerous, it's just a nice set. You can have expensive effects, but if the monster doesn't scare us, they're just expensive effects. You can have committed actors throwing themselves into the action, but if the story is not gripping, the physical effort only carries you so far. So yes, the craftsmanship is there. The problem is that the movie never turns that craftsmanship into a living, breathing horror adventure experience. It has all the pieces of a big studio film, but not enough of the soul that would make those pieces matter. Now we have to talk about Tom Cruise in this movie, because honestly, he is one of the strangest parts of the whole thing. Not because Tom Cruise can't carry a blockbuster. Obviously he can. That's not the issue. If anything, he has spent decades proving that he knows how to hold the center of a big studio action film. He can run, fight, sell danger, throw himself into stunts, and keep a movie moving through sheer screen energy. But The Mummy is where that strength becomes part of the problem. Because this is supposed to be a monster movie, at least partly. The title is not Nick Morton. It's not Tom Cruise runs from ancient Egypt. It's The Mummy. And yet so much of the film feels shaped around Cruise's usual action star presence that the monster story starts bending around him. You can feel the movie trying to make Nick Morton into this charming rogue. He's supposed to be selfish, reckless, a little seductive, a little funny, the kind of guy who steals artifacts, makes bad decisions, and still somehow wins people over. On paper, that's not a bad lead for a mummy story. A morally questionable treasure hunter who gets cursed because of his own greed? That works. But Cruise never feels completely natural in that version of the role. The roguish comedy does not sit comfortably on him here. The banter feels forced. The smirking, slightly sleazy energy feels like the movie is trying to push him into a character type that doesn't really match what he does best. Cruise is usually strongest when he's locked into intensity. Mission, danger, discipline, panic, desperation. But Nick Morton is written like a man who should have a more relaxed, scoundrel-like charm, and the fit is awkward. You can especially feel it in the early scenes. The film wants the opening to have this buddy adventure energy with Nick and Chris Vail joking around in the middle of danger. But instead of making Nick more likable, it makes him feel weirdly thin. He's not funny enough to be charming, not selfish enough to be truly interesting, and not vulnerable enough yet to be sympathetic. He just sort of moves through the chaos with that familiar Tom Cruise intensity, even when the movie is asking for something looser. And then, when the action kicks in, he suddenly makes more sense. That's the funny part. Whenever Nick is running, fighting, surviving, or being thrown into some impossible physical situation, Cruise looks much more at home. The plane sequence works partly because he understands that kind of cinema. He knows how to make physical danger feel immediate. He knows how to use his body in an action scene. But the more comfortable Cruise becomes, the less the movie feels like a mummy film. It starts feeling like a Tom Cruise action vehicle with horror decorations around it, and that imbalance hurts the film badly. Aminette should be pulling the story into her world, but Cruise keeps pulling it back into his. Instead of being swallowed by the curse, the movie keeps protecting him as the heroic center. That also affects the tone. A darker version of this story might have made Nick feel smaller, a man completely out of his depth, trapped by a force older and stronger than him. But because it's Tom Cruise, the film keeps pushing him toward action hero territory. Even when he's cursed, even when he's confused, even when the supernatural should be overwhelming him, you never fully feel like the movie is willing to let him be powerless. And that's a problem in horror. Sometimes the lead character needs to be scared in a way that makes us scared. Nick often feels inconvenienced, shocked, or physically tested, but not truly broken by what is happening. Cruise brings star power, but that star power creates a kind of safety around him. The movie also struggles with his age and persona, not in a cheap way, but in terms of character energy. Nick is written with this boyish, irresponsible, seductive thief behavior, and it doesn't always feel believable coming from Cruise at this point in his career. The role might have worked better with someone who could play charmingly pathetic, morally slippery, and genuinely overwhelmed. Cruise plays him more like a familiar blockbuster lead waiting to become heroic, and that makes the character less interesting than he could have been. To be fair, this is not a lazy performance. Cruise is not phoning it in physically. He commits to the movement, the action, the panic beats, the spectacle. But commitment is not the same thing as fit. You can give energy to a role and still be wrong for the shape of the movie. That's what happens here. Tom Cruise brings scale, but he also brings baggage. He brings credibility as an action star, but he also drags the film away from horror. He gives the studio a marketable lead, but the price is that The Mummy becomes less about the mummy, and in the end, that might be the clearest way to describe the problem. Cruise doesn't ruin the movie by being bad in the usual sense. He hurts the movie because his presence is too strong for the kind of story this should have been. The film needed a protagonist who could be consumed by the monster's world. Instead, it gives us a star who keeps turning the monster's world into his own. Nick Morton is one of those characters where you can see the outline of a better arc, but the movie never really earns it. The idea is simple enough. He starts as a selfish guy. Not evil exactly, but definitely not heroic. He steals artifacts, lies to people, uses charm when it benefits him, and treats ancient history like something he can loot and sell. He is not entering this story with noble intentions, and for a mummy movie, that actually makes sense. A character like that should be punished by the story. He disturbs the dead, disrespects the tomb, and wakes up something ancient that he does not understand. There is a classic horror logic in that. You cross a line, and the curse follows you home. The problem is that The Mummy does not build Nick's transformation with enough care. At the beginning, he is presented as this reckless treasure hunter type. He sleeps with Jenny, steals from her, jokes around with Vale, and generally behaves like a man who thinks consequences are for other people. Fine, that can work. But then the movie wants him to become emotionally sincere, self-sacrificing, and heroic by the end. That kind of change needs steps. We need to see guilt. We need to see fear. We need to see him realize that his choices have hurt people. We need to feel him slowly becoming someone different, not because the plot pushes him there, but because the experience genuinely breaks something open inside him. Instead, Nick's morality keeps shifting whenever the movie needs it to. One moment he's a selfish thief, then he's a frightened victim, then he's doing action hero things, then he's emotionally attached to Jenny, then he's the chosen vessel for ancient evil. Then he's making a heroic decision that the film wants us to treat as meaningful. But the emotional bridge between those versions is weak. It's not that the character can't be complicated. A flawed lead is usually more interesting than a perfect one. The issue is that Nick doesn't feel complicated in a human way. He feels inconsistent in a screenwriting way, like different versions of the character are being pulled from different drafts of the movie. Sometimes he belongs in a buddy adventure. Sometimes he belongs in a horror film. Sometimes he belongs in a Tom Cruise action franchise. Sometimes he belongs in a supernatural superhero origin story. And because the movie itself keeps changing genres, Nick keeps changing with it. He becomes a reflection of the film's confusion. That also makes his relationship with Jenny harder to believe. The story wants their connection to matter, especially later on, but Nick spends so much of the early film acting like a shallow opportunist that the emotional turn feels rushed. The movie tells us there is something deeper there, but it does not give that relationship enough time or texture to make the final choices land properly. The same thing happens with his curse. Being chosen by Amunet should be terrifying. It should force Nick to confront who he is, what he wants, and how much of himself he might lose. That could have been the real psychological core of the movie, a selfish man slowly realizing that his body and soul are being claimed by something ancient. But the film treats the curse more like a plot engine than an emotional crisis. Nick sees things, he gets warnings, he is pulled toward Amunet, he panics. But we do not really feel a deep internal struggle. The movie keeps everything moving too fast for that. It wants the curse to be scary, romantic, action-driven, and franchise-important all at once, so it never becomes personal enough. And that is where the character falls apart. By the time Nick is pushed toward heroism, the movie has not fully convinced us that he has changed. It has just moved him from one required position to the next. He begins as the selfish guy who causes the problem, and he ends as the heroic figure who becomes part of the solution, but the middle does not do enough work. That's why his arc feels hollow. A stronger version of the Mummy would have leaned harder into Nick's flaws. Let him be truly cowardly. Let him be genuinely selfish. Let the curse expose that. Let Amunet tempt him not just because he is chosen, but because some part of him actually wants power, escape, or immortality. Then his final decision would mean something. But this movie plays it safer. It wants Nick to be flawed, but not too flawed. Funny, but not too funny. Dark, but not too dark. Heroic, but not too late. So he ends up feeling less like a person and more like a character being adjusted scene by scene to match whatever tone the movie is chasing at that moment. And when your protagonist feels that unstable, the whole movie feels unstable with him. Another thing that quietly hurts the movie is how strangely indestructible Nick Morton feels. And yes, I know this is a supernatural action movie. I'm not expecting medical realism from the mummies. People are cursed. Dead bodies walk around, ancient gods are involved, and the entire story is built on impossible things. That's fine. But even in a movie like this, danger still has to feel like it matters. Nick survives so much that, after a while, the action starts losing its bite. He gets thrown into chaos, shot at, blasted around, chased, cursed, dragged through impossible situations, and of course, there's the plane crash. And the movie keeps treating these moments like they're intense, but the physical consequences never feel heavy enough. That becomes a problem. Because when a character keeps walking away from disaster with barely any lasting damage, the audience slowly stops worrying. You start watching the action less like, how is he going to survive this? And more like, okay, what ridiculous thing is he going to survive now? That may sound small, but it changes the whole feeling of the film. A horror adventure story needs vulnerability. The characters should feel like they are dealing with forces bigger than themselves, especially here because Nick is not supposed to be some unstoppable superhero. He's a reckless soldier and artifact thief who accidentally gets tangled up in an ancient curse. He should feel outmatched. But too often, the movie protects him, and part of that probably comes from Tom Cruise's screen image. We are used to seeing Cruise survive impossible missions. We are used to seeing him run through danger, take hits, crash through obstacles, and keep moving. That works in Mission Impossible, because those films are built around that physical myth. The whole appeal is watching him push himself through insane stunts. But the Mummy needed a slightly different kind of fear. Nick should not feel like Ethan Hunt with a curse. He should feel like a man who has disturbed something ancient and is slowly realizing that his body, his mind, and maybe even his soul are no longer fully his. That is much scarier than just watching him survive another explosion. The invincible hero problem also weakens Amunet. If she is supposed to be this terrifying ancient force, then the people around her should feel breakable. Her curse should leave marks. Her presence should change the room. Her power should make Nick feel smaller, not more special. But because Nick keeps surviving everything, the threat starts feeling less dangerous than the movie wants it to feel. And it's not just about injuries, it's emotional consequence too. Nick goes through events that should completely shake him, but the movie often moves on too quickly. There is not enough time to feel the trauma of what he has experienced. The curse does not seem to break him down in a slow, unsettling way. The film uses danger as spectacle more than consequence. That's why some of the action feels hollow. A plane crash should feel catastrophic. Being chosen by an ancient evil should feel horrifying. Seeing the dead return should leave a mark. Not every monster film has to reinvent horror or become some unforgettable cinematic event. Sometimes, a movie just needs to be a decent late-night watch, something loud, weird, fast-moving, and messy enough that you can throw it on without asking too much from it. And on that level, I can understand why some people don't hate this movie. There is a kind of popcorn entertainment buried in here. You have Tom Cruise running through supernatural chaos. You have an ancient princess coming back from the dead. You have zombies, curses, plane crashes, secret monster labs, Russell Crowe turning into Hyde, and a whole lot of ridiculous mythology being thrown at the screen. If you approach it as serious horror, it disappoints. If you approach it as the beginning of a grand universal monster revival, it disappoints even more. But if you approach it as a strange, overstuffed B-movie with a blockbuster budget, it becomes a little easier to enjoy in pieces. And I think that's important to admit, because the film is not completely unwatchable. It's not one of those movies where every scene feels dead. There are moments of energy. The plane crash is fun. Aminette looks cool. Some of the undead imagery works. The modern setting gives the story a slightly different flavor. And even the messy Jekyll material has that odd, what is this movie doing now? Quality that can be entertaining if you're in the right mood. There is some junk food pleasure here. The problem is that the movie was not sold as junk food. It was sold like a major event, a franchise launcher, a serious reboot of Universal's monster legacy. And once you judge it by that standard, the flaws become much harder to ignore. That's where the B-movie defense gets tricky. Because yes, the film can be mildly fun if you lower expectations. But should you have to lower them this much for a movie with this title, this budget, this cast, and this much studio confidence behind it? Probably not. A smaller, cheaper, more self-aware version of this movie might have been easier to forgive. If The Mummy had leaned into its silliness, embraced the weirdness, and stopped pretending it was laying the foundation for some massive mythology, it might have worked better as pure monster pulp. There's nothing wrong with pulp. There's nothing wrong with a ridiculous action horror ride. But this movie keeps wanting to be both disposable fun and important franchise architecture. That's the tension. The B-movie parts want to run wild. The studio universe parts want to look serious and expensive. So the film ends up in this awkward middle space where it is too silly to be grand, but too self-important to be fully fun. Still, if someone tells me they enjoyed it as a one-time watch, I get it. Maybe they liked the effects. Maybe they liked the pace. Maybe they liked Sofia Boutella. Maybe they just wanted a supernatural action movie with some creepy imagery and didn't care about the bigger dark universe problem. That's fair. There are movies that fail critically but still work as background entertainment, airplane entertainment, lazy weekend entertainment. The Mummy E can probably survive in that category, but that is also a very limited kind of praise, because the best defense of the movie is basically, it's not as bad if you don't expect too much. And for a film trying to resurrect one of Hollywood's classic monsters, that's a pretty low ceiling. So yes, there is some fun here. Scattered fun, compromised fun, the kind of fun that appears for a scene, disappears for 20 minutes, then comes back in some weird over-the-top moment that makes you briefly pay attention again. But that's not enough to call the movie good. It just means the film has enough movement and spectacle to avoid being completely lifeless. And maybe that's the fairest way to put it. The Mummy is not boring every second, and it is not worthless as a casual watch. But it is much easier to enjoy as accidental B-movie nonsense than as the polished monster epic Universal clearly wanted it to be. So after everything, I don't think The Mummy's a film you can honestly call completely worthless. That would be too easy. There are things here that work. Sofia Boutella is good. Actually, she's more than good. She gives the movie one of the only elements that feels genuinely memorable. The plane crash is a strong set piece. Some of the creature design is impressive. The makeup team clearly did real work. The basic idea of a cursed princess waking up in the modern world has potential. Even the concept of Universal bringing its monsters back is not a bad idea by itself. That's what makes the movie frustrating. If this had been a lazy film with no talent, no concept, no resources, and no interesting pieces, it would be easier to dismiss. You just say it failed and move on. But The Mummy is not that simple. It has enough good ingredients that you can see the stronger version hiding inside it. And honestly, that stronger version is not hard to imagine. Focus more on Aminette. Let the horror breathe. Make Nick's curse feel personal and disturbing. Use Jekyll with restraint. Keep Prodigium in the shadows. Let the modern setting feel haunted instead of just loud. Give Jenny more agency. Cut down the jokes. Stop trying to launch 5 future movies before this one has earned its ending. None of that sounds impossible. That's the painful part. The movie didn't fail because The Mummy is impossible to modernize. It didn't fail because audiences refuse to watch classic monsters anymore. It didn't fail because the premise had no appeal. It failed because the priorities were wrong. The film keeps choosing expansion over focus. It wants a universe before it has a story. It wants spectacle before suspense. It wants jokes before atmosphere. It wants Tom Cruise hero mythology before monster mythology. It wants to feel huge, but it forgets to feel specific. And that is why the final result is so uneven. There are moments where you think, okay, maybe this is starting to work. Amunet appears, and the movie gets sharper. The plane sequence hits, and suddenly there's real energy. Some of the tomb imagery shows up, and you can briefly see the gothic adventure film underneath. But then the film swerves again, into exposition, into comic relief, into franchise setup, into another tonal shift that pulls you out. It never holds on to its best instincts long enough. That's the main issue. A good monster movie needs confidence. It needs to know what kind of fear, fun, or fascination it is creating. The Mummy keeps hesitating. It keeps trying to be darker, funnier, bigger, safer, more connected, more familiar, and more marketable all at once. And eventually, all those competing goals start canceling each other out. So where does that leave the movie? Somewhere in the middle, honestly. Not the worst blockbuster ever made. Not some unwatchable disaster from start to finish, but also nowhere near the film it should have been. It is polished enough to pass as entertainment in places, but confused enough that the entertainment never becomes satisfying. It has craft, but not enough personality. It has action, but not enough tension. It has horror imagery, but not enough fear. It has a monster, but not enough focus on the monster. It has a universe, but not enough reason to care about that universe. And that's probably the fairest criticism. The Mummy is not empty because nothing is there. It's empty because the things that are there never come together with purpose. You can enjoy pieces of it. You can defend it as a casual watch. You can point to Boutella, the plane crash, the design work, and say there was something here. And you'd be right. But you can also look at the whole film and feel the disappointment of a movie that had the tools to be sharper, stranger, and far more memorable than what we got. That's the final balance for me. Not a total failure in every department, just a film with enough potential to make its failure harder to forgive. So, final verdict, The Mummy's 2017 is not the resurrection Universal was hoping for. And the frustrating thing is, it really could have been. The pieces were sitting right there, a classic monster with history behind it. A new mummy with a strong visual presence. Sofia Boutella giving the role more personality than the script gives her credit for. A modern setting that could have made the curse feel fresh. A plane crash sequence that proves the movie could deliver spectacle when it had a clear idea. Even the bigger Universal monster concept had potential if it had been handled with more patience. But the finished film is too distracted by what it wants to become later to focus on what it needs to be right now. That's the simplest way to put it. It doesn't feel like a confident monster movie. It feels like a movie constantly being pulled between studio expectations. Be scary, be funny, be huge, be connected, be a Tom Cruise vehicle, be a franchise starter, be modern, be nostalgic, be everything at once. And because of that, it never becomes one strong thing. It has horror, but not enough fear. It has action, but not enough tension. It has jokes, but not enough laughs. It has mythology, but not enough mystery. It has a monster, but not enough attention on the monster. That last part is what really hurts. A film called The Mummy should leave you thinking about the mummy. It should make the creature feel powerful, tragic, cursed, unforgettable, something. But by the end, what you mostly remember is the franchise machinery around her, the dark universe setup, Dr. Jekyll, Prodigium, Tom Cruise being pushed towards some larger heroic destiny. Amunet gets buried inside her own movie, and honestly, that feels like the perfect image for what went wrong. Universal wanted to bring its monsters back to life, but instead of letting one monster story breathe, it covered the film in world-building, CGI noise, awkward humor, and blockbuster formula. The result is not completely dead, but it's not alive in the way it should be either. It's watchable. In places, even enjoyable. But it's also forgettable, confused, and strangely hollow. There are moments where you can see a sharper film trying to escape, a darker version, a cleaner version, a version that trusted the curse, trusted Amunet, trusted suspense, and didn't feel the need to announce an entire universe before earning one good story. That version sounds genuinely exciting. This version mostly feels like a missed chance. So I wouldn't call The Mummy one of the worst blockbusters ever made. That feels too dramatic. But I would call it one of those movies where the failure is more interesting than the film itself. It shows what happens when a studio mistakes recognition for investment, scale for atmosphere, and franchise planning for storytelling. For a casual watch, you might get some fun out of it. For a Universal monster revival, though, it falls short. And for a movie about awakening something ancient, powerful, and terrifying, the biggest problem is pretty simple. It never really comes to life.